In 1695, as the 17th century flickered like the last ember in a fireplace, an exhausted expedition wound its way through the tropical forests of Central America. Leading them was a young Spanish friar, Andrés de Avendaño y Loyola. His bare feet bled from flint shards, his monastic robe torn by thorns. He and his companions moved through the humid air thick with the scent of rotting leaves. They weren't just fleeing blades and spears, they were running from the weight of failure etched into history, their mission to convert the king of Tikal, the last Maya stronghold on an island in Lake Petén Itzá, had failed. After multiple rounds of negotiation, the indigenous king had firmly rejected both baptism and the authority of Madrid. Now, Avendaño was retreating, struggling to survive in the rugged terrain sustained only by wild sugarcane and drops of water squeezed from jungle vines. Sweat clung bitterly to their skin while the screech of jungle cicadas drilled into their ears, repeating two words again and again: failure. Then suddenly, the canopy opened, and before them rose a colossal stone pyramid, its flanks draped in strangler fig roots and gray-green vines, its peak piercing through the mists of dusk. This wasn't Tikal, nor any Spanish outpost. This was Tikal, a once magnificent capital that had reigned for 7 centuries, then fallen silent more than 500 years before Europeans ever set foot on these lands. Though faint from hunger, Avendaño still climbed the pyramid's steep slope, each step rising to his knee. In his journal, he described vaulted halls like those of a convent, small rooms with whitewashed walls, a mirage of a cloistered sanctuary lost in the rain-soaked jungle. From the summit, he gazed out upon the deep green sea of the Yucatan, a spiraling forest stretching to the edge of the world. The friar's heart fell quiet. How could a city capable of building a 64-meter tower, equal to a 22-story building, simply vanish without a trace? He had no time to answer, but the seed of mystery had been planted, one that would echo through the centuries to come. Few in his party realized they were standing at the heart of a city that once held 90,000 inhabitants. Stone plazas had once echoed with conch horns and wooden drums. White-plastered causeways had swarmed with traders carrying cacao jade and quetzal feathers. Now it was all devoured by the forest, where only strangler figs clung tightly to crumbling reliefs of the jaguar sun god. That night, firelight flickered against the pyramid's flank, casting dancing shadows, as Avendaño felt himself dwarfed by a monument built by hands that had never known iron. In his fevered thirst, he nearly believed it wasn't the king of Tikal who had guided him here, but the ancient gods of the Maya reaching across time like a message folded in stone. For more than 2 centuries, Avendaño's notes would sink like a pebble in a well. It wasn't until the early 19th century that his secret would ignite anew, thanks to 2 companions, explorer-writer John Lloyd Stephens and illustrator Frederick Catherwood. In 1839, following rumors of a stone city hidden in the Guatemalan jungle, they set off on a 2-week trek across mud-choked rivers, swarmed by biting insects' wheels snapping under the weight of time. Fate turned a corner when they looked up and saw the tip of a pyramid emerging from the canopy, silhouetted against the damp sky. They climbed stone steps intact in some places, collapsed in others, where tree roots had forced them apart, and wove their way through a forest of monuments tangled in vines. Catherwood lit his oil lamp, sketching patterns worn smooth by time. Stephens quietly took notes: 64 meters tall, 365 steps, a number that whispered of the Maya solar calendar. From that moment, they were no longer mere explorers. They were messengers pulling back the veil on a history Europe had long ignored. Over the next 3 years, the pair surveyed more than 40 sites: Copán, Uxmal, Palenque. They hired forest hands to clear sight lines, built wooden scaffolds to reach statues towering several meters high, all at the cost of malarial fevers and jungle leeches. Their illustrated volumes, published in London in 1841, caused a sensation. Readers were stunned. How could brown-skinned peoples have built palaces without wheels or pulleys? The shock gave rise to theories from Atlantis to ancient astronauts. But the artifacts, ceramics painted with scenes of hot chocolate rituals, green obsidian blades, proved otherwise. It was all indigenous. Stevens dismissed the wild speculation with gentle precision. These ruins, though broken, remain the most beautiful flower of the Americas placed upon the banquet table of history. That line made readers pause. It urged them to stop claiming credit and start listening to the forest, to the limestone, to the silent whispers of 40 cities, millions of people, and 7 centuries of glory that had vanished into shadow. We must also remember, before the sword and the war dogs of the conquistadors, a quieter killer had arrived: smallpox. As early as the 16th century, disease traveled faster than ships or soldiers, spreading from port to jungle, quietly decimating Maya populations, dissolving religious networks and agricultural lifelines before a single cannon had fired. By the time the final armored columns crossed the karst hills, they found only withered villages, abandoned fields. The sword and flame merely sealed a tragedy already long underway. That is why the moment when Avendaño's bloodied foot touched the stone stair of Tikal in 1695 reverberates with a somber beauty, reminding us that no citadel outlasts the slow erosion of time. When Avendaño in 1695 and Stevens in 1839 stood before the same scene, a moss-red spire rising above a sea of leaves, they shared a common emotion: wonder laced with mourning. Human glory, however tall, must eventually converse with roots, rain, and plague. And it is precisely this erosion that lends the ruins their haunting beauty enough to make the hearts of later generations tremble. Imagine a civilization that could build pyramids taller than the trees, carve thousands of glyphs into stone by hand, and track solar eclipses down to the hour, yet never invented the wheel, never used pulleys, and never forged tools from metal. That's the first paradox you face when you step into the world of the Maya, a world where beauty, brilliance, and contradiction lived side by side, like roots tangled in stone. Around 1800 BCE, long before the rise of Rome or the temples of Athens, small communities across what's now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras began growing maize beans, chili peppers, and cacao. But these people weren't just farmers. They were stargazers, poets, architects of time. One of their most stunning achievements was a cyclical calendar system, a kind of spiritual mathematics that let them chart planetary movements with naked eyes and logic, mapping time in spans of thousands of years. Their precision rivaled that of medieval Europe, except they were doing it in the middle of a rainforest centuries earlier, without metal glass or telescopes. The Maya never built a single unified empire. Instead, they were more like a web of city-states, each with its own king, its own rivalries, and its own character. Think Renaissance Italy, a Tikal as crowded and ambitious as Florence, a Calakmul with the secrecy and swagger of Venice, a Copán, radiating spiritual authority like Vatican Rome. What connected them wasn't a central ruler, but shared language roots, shared gods, and a shared way of measuring the heavens. And yet, for all their brilliance, they built their cities in a place that almost dared them to fail. The Yucatan Peninsula is a land without rivers. The ground is made of porous limestone full of hidden caves and sinkholes called cenotes, where rain vanishes underground as quickly as it falls. No Nile, no Tigris, no Euphrates, just stone heat and a haunting silence when the rains didn't come. But instead of leaving the Maya adapted, They lined natural sinkholes with plaster to store water, engineered terraced fields and canals to move it downhill, and worshipped the underground as the gateway to the afterlife. The same caves that saved their crops also housed their gods. They didn't have pack animals. No oxen, no horses, no donkeys. Instead, they invented a forehead strap harness, a painfully efficient way to carry goods on foot, the weight balanced across your spine by a loop around your forehead. It's hard to imagine now. Picture a global economy without trucks or trains, but somehow it runs on human backs and jungle trails. And still it worked. They built Sac Bay elevated white roads of crushed limestone cutting through the forest to connect their cities. Some were built for trade, others just for ritual, so kings and priests could walk above the mud like gods among trees. Their cities were marvels. The pyramids of Tikal reached 64 meters high, about the height of a 22-story building. But that's not what made them spectacular. It was the detail. The temples weren't just tall, they were alive with images. Painted walls told stories of battles, rituals, and offerings. Hieroglyphs carved deep into stone recorded names, dates, and dynasties. And here's the thing. The Maya were the only people in the Americas to develop a full written language before European contact. Their script was playful, metaphor-rich, packed with double meanings. To read Maya glyphs was to swim through poetry, math, astronomy, and myth at the same time. And they did all of this without metal. Their sharpest blades were made of obsidian, a volcanic glass sharper than surgical steel. Using these, they carved massive monuments, fitted giant limestone blocks with millimeter precision, and etched calendars into bone and shell. When you run your hand across a Maya carving, you're feeling a world shaped entirely by stone sweat and skill. But their genius wasn't just vertical, it was horizontal. Their cities spread wide across the jungle, built without a single beast of burden. No cranes, no carts. Everything moved by hand. You might expect a people like this to live in rich, lush farmland, but the Maya did the opposite. Their land was brutal. In many places, the soil was only a few inches deep before hitting rock. And yet they made it work for a very long time. They practiced slash-and-burn agriculture. Clear a patch of forest, burn it, plant corn for a few seasons, and then move on. It worked beautifully as long as the population stayed low and the forest had time to heal. The Maya knew this. Their worldview, their rituals, even their understanding of time was cyclical. They saw history itself as a circle, worlds created and destroyed in repeating loops, gods born and sacrificed again and again. And perhaps that's why their farming mirrored that same rhythm: use, rest, renew. But success has a way of crowding out wisdom. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Copán grew fast. Too fast. As populations surged, so did the pressure to feed more mouths. The old cycles were squeezed. Fallow land, once allowed to recover for years, was replanted too soon. Forests once sacred were cleared to make way for permanent fields. And slowly, the balance broke. You can imagine the tension: a farmer standing on a bare patch of earth that once fed his family, now crumbling to dust. A priest consulting the calendar, watching rain prayers fail. A child asking why the corn won't grow. These aren't just ecological issues. They're human ones. By the time the great cities reached their peak somewhere between the 6th and 8th centuries CE, their entire way of life was balanced on a razor's edge. And still, they kept building, kept writing, kept believing. It was a golden age, but it was standing on soil that was slowly dying beneath their feet. As Maya cities swelled with life, the demands on their fragile ecosystem became relentless. By the 8th century, places like Tikal were home to tens of thousands of people, 65,000 in the city center, alone with another 30,000 in the surrounding outskirts. That's a population density of more than 800 people per square kilometer. For a civilization without wheels, animals, or metal tools, it's a staggering feat. But for the land itself, it was too much. The more the cities grew, the more forest had to be cleared, not just for farms, but for fuel. Maya temples and palaces weren't built with dry stone alone. Their signature white plaster facades required limestone to be burned in large quantities. That process needed massive amounts of wood, not just to create lime, but to bake it into a mortar strong enough to last centuries. Imagine entire groves turned to ash just to cover one temple wall in shining white. Now multiply that across 40 major cities, and you begin to see the cost. We often picture Maya ruins today as being swallowed by jungle, and that's true now, but not back then. Pollen samples taken from lake beds and swamps across the region show that by the late Classic period, the Maya lowlands had been almost entirely deforested. If you had stood atop a temple in Tikal around the year 800, you wouldn't have seen an endless green canopy. You would have seen farmland stretching in every direction, dotted with homes, smoke from cook fires, and people hauling bundles of maize on their backs. The cycle of slash-and-burn agriculture, which had worked for centuries, was now being pushed beyond its limits. There wasn't enough time for the soil to recover. Without trees, topsoil washed away in the rains. With the forest gone, temperatures rose, local rainfall patterns shifted, and water storage systems began to strain. The delicate relationship the Maya had with their land, one that had been built on balance, started to fracture. Food storage was another vulnerability. In the humid climate of the southern lowlands, it was hard to keep corn for more than a year. Mold, insects, and rot came quickly. This meant that Maya cities had very little buffer when crops failed. One bad season could mean hunger. Two could mean collapse. And then came the drought. Scientists studying sediment layers and ice cores have found evidence of a severe mega-drought beginning around 760 CE, one of the worst the region had seen in 7,000 years. Caused in part by a natural dip in solar radiation, this dry spell wasn't just one bad year. It stretched on and off for decades, starving the land and the people who depended on it. The rain belts moved north, the trade winds shifted, and the jungles that once fed entire kingdoms became brittle and bare. Maya society, so carefully woven, began to unravel. Farms failed. Irrigation systems dried up. Fields that once thrived turned to dust. The king, once seen as the intermediary between gods and weather, could no longer guarantee harvests. In Maya belief, the ruler was not just a political figure. He was a cosmic bridge responsible for keeping the universe in harmony. When the crops failed, that wasn't just a sign of environmental stress. It was a sign that the king had lost divine favor. And when divine favor slips, people stop obeying. Evidence from the city of Copán in present-day Honduras gives us one of the clearest windows into what collapse looked like on the ground. Nestled in a narrow valley, Copán had thrived thanks to fertile silt from the river. Its people built one of the largest ball courts in the Maya world and adorned their monuments with intricate bat glyphs, the city's emblem. But by the mid-8th century, that fertile bottomland was fully occupied. New homes began to climb the valley walls onto steep, erodible hillsides where soil was thin and poor. To build on those slopes, the Maya cleared the pine forests that once held the hills together. Without tree roots to stabilize them, the hillsides collapsed, and acidic soil washed down into the valley, poisoning the farmland below. Within a few generations, Copán's agricultural base was gutted from both above and below. Farmers struggled. Food ran low. People moved out. Skeletal remains from this period tell a chilling story. Signs of malnutrition and disease increased dramatically, both among commoners and the elite. Bones grew porous. Teeth showed stress lines. Even royal burials showed signs of hunger. It wasn't just the peasants who were suffering. The whole system was cracking. In 822 CE, Copán's last known king, a man named Tuk, came to power during a time of chaos. He began commissioning a four-sided stone monument standard practice for new rulers, but only one side was completed. The others remained blank. The carving simply stopped. It's as if the sculptor dropped his tools and walked away. 30 years later, the royal palace was burned, and the city's political structure collapsed for good. But the people didn't vanish overnight. A century later, around 950 CE, roughly half the population still remained clinging to the last usable land. By the 12th century, even that was gone. The forest moved back in erasing the last signs of human life. Elsewhere, similar stories played out. In Tikal, after a brief resurgence, the same patterns emerged. Temples stopped being built, alliances crumbled, and inscriptions once used to proclaim royal power faded to silence. Some of the city's sacred monuments were moved or defaced by commoners who took over abandoned palaces. They scratched graffiti into the plastered walls, leaving behind rough drawings of temples, people, and animals. Sometimes they even re-erected monuments upside down, likely unaware of the meanings inscribed on them. They still worshipped the old gods, still made offerings, but the knowledge of what the symbols meant of who had built this place and why was slipping away. By the year 900, the classic Maya cities of the southern lowlands had gone dark one by one. And what's remarkable is that in none of the thousands of inscriptions we've found is there any warning. No prophetic panic, no mention of famine, of climate, or disease. The carvings remain ornate and optimistic right up to the end. And then, silence. The lights didn't go out all at once. It was more like a slow dimming city after city, flickering away until all that remained were the bones of temples and the whisper of leaves. And though the Maya people never disappeared, millions still live in the region today, speaking their ancestral languages. The great urban heart of their civilization was gone. It's tempting to ask, why didn't they move back in once the drought passed? Why not rebuild? But maybe the answer is right there in the silence. The land had been stripped bare. The gods had gone quiet. The cities once sacred had failed. And perhaps for the Maya to return was to repeat a mistake they had no words left to describe. Long before the great Maya cities began to fall silent, there were two powers locked in a struggle that shaped the destiny of the entire region, Tikal and Calakmul. These weren't just rival cities, they were rival visions of what it meant to rule a civilization. One was outward-looking, eager to align itself with distant empires. The other, more insular, saw itself as the true inheritor of Maya tradition. And between them lay a centuries-long Cold War of spies symbols and the slow tightening of nooses. By the 4th century, CE Tikal had risen like a stone colossus out of the forest. Nestled deep in the Guatemalan lowlands, it wasn't just a city, it was an empire in the making. And behind much of that momentum was a distant but formidable ally, Teotihuacan, the massive highland city over 1,500 kilometers away near what is now Mexico City. At the time, Teotihuacan was the 6th largest city in the world, with more than 125,000 residents. Its influence stretched across Mesoamerica through a potent mix of trade diplomacy and military power. Teotihuacan controlled the trade in green obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for its hardness and brilliant color. This stone found at Teotihuacan's doorstep became both a tool and a weapon. The Maya considered it sacred, and wherever it traveled, Teotihuacan's shadow followed. At some point, early in the 4th century, Tikal fell under this shadow. A new king came to power, Yaxnun Ahin, whose name meant curl nose. On one of Tikal's surviving monuments, he's depicted being crowned while foreign soldiers from Teotihuacan Look on their weapons, unmistakable atlatls or dart throwers common in the Mexican highlands but unknown in the Maya lowlands. In his burial, archaeologists later found offerings made from that telltale green obsidian quiet tokens of the foreign hands that helped shape Tikal's rise. From this moment, Tikal exploded outward. Its military expanded. Its neighbors began to inscribe the word Ajah, his lord, when referring to Tikal's kings, a sign that they had been conquered or subjugated. Across the Maya lowlands, from the jungles of Belize to the valleys of Honduras, Tikal's influence grew. And with every new monument carved, every new temple built, the message was clear. Tikal was not just a city. It was the beating heart of a Maya empire. But in the east, beyond the hills and rivers, another city was watching. Calakmul, hidden deep in the jungle near the border of modern-day Campeche, Mexico, wasn't as flamboyant as Tikal. It didn't flaunt its obsidian or boast foreign embassies. Instead, it built quietly, strategically, like a spider weaving its web. Its rulers called themselves the Khanul, the lords of the snake, and their city was filled with serpent imagery. Stylized fangs, coiled bodies, the curling head glyph that made the sound Khan in Maya script. The snake was not just a symbol of power, it was a strategy to strike only when the prey was cornered. Calakmul also differed in how it told its story. While Tikal's monuments mostly celebrated male kings, Calakmul often emphasized female rulers recording the joint rule of kings and queens, a striking distinction in a world where lineage meant everything. They traced their ancestry not to distant foreign powers, but to the ancient cities of the pre-classic period, suggesting that their claim to rule lay in blood and tradition, not outside influence. Throughout the 5th and early 6th centuries, Calakmul watched as Tikal expanded and slowly began gathering allies. One by one, it reached out to the small kingdoms surrounding Tikal cities like El Peru dos Pilas and Caracol, and offered them a choice: remain under Tikal's shadow or join the snake's embrace. Their method wasn't always war. Often, it was politics, strategic marriages, gift-giving, symbolic monuments erected in border cities inscribed with the snake emblem marking the shift of power without ever firing an arrow. Calakmul's snakehead stones began to appear in places where Tikal's influence had once been strong. It was slow, deliberate suffocation. By the middle of the 6th century, the balance had shifted. Teotihuacan, the empire that once propped up Tikal, had collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Trade routes broke, alliances faded, and Tikal was suddenly alone, surrounded by enemies that it had once called vassals. The noose was tightening. At the center of this growing crisis stood a king history remembers only as Double Bird. His name appears in inscriptions, but his actions speak louder. Under his reign, Tikal made a critical error, one that would trigger a chain of events it would take 100 years to recover from. The city of Caracol, in what is now Belize, had long been a loyal vassal of Tikal. It paid tribute, sent warriors when called, and inscribed Tikal's name with respect. But in 553 CE, something changed. Whether it was a diplomatic insult, unpaid tribute, or whispers of Calakmul's influence, Double Bird ordered an attack. Not a formal war, but an axe war, a low-level raid meant to punish. Tikal's soldiers swept into Caracol's lands, burned villages, kidnapped nobles, and returned home with spoils. It was business as usual. But this time, Caracol didn't bow. It called on Calakmul. And together, they answered not with another raid, but with something far more serious. A star war. In the Maya script, the glyph for a star war is haunting a star raining fire down upon the earth. Unlike the symbolic skirmishes that had defined much of Maya warfare, a star war was something different. It meant total destruction. Not just a battle, but the dismantling of a kingdom temple's defaced kings, humiliated monuments toppled. It was in essence the end of a world, and in 562 CE, the alliance of Calakmul and Karakul turned this symbolic threat into violent reality. Tikal, once the most powerful city in the lowlands, was surrounded and besieged. Its defenses designed for rituals and procession, not prolonged war, were overwhelmed. Enemy forces swept into the city, defacing sacred shrines, toppling stelae, and smashing the carved faces of kings. Monuments that had once proclaimed power were now broken and buried, their fragments hidden like shameful memories. No one knows exactly what happened to Doublebird, the king who led Tikal into this trap. Some speculate he was captured and sacrificed atop a foreign pyramid. Others believe he died in exile. What we do know is that he was never mentioned again, and that when Tikal re-emerged a century later, it was under a new ruler with no blood ties to him. The aftermath of the Star War was not just physical, it was cultural. For the next 100 years, no major monuments were erected in Tikal. Royal tombs were simple, their offerings meager. The painted ceramics that once decorated the palaces faded into obscurity. The city's voice, once loud and proud across the lowlands, fell silent. In the vacuum, Calakmul rose. With Tikal subdued, the Lords of the Snake extended their influence across the Yucatan. They fortified alliances, established proxy rulers in rival cities, and carved their emblem, the serpent head glyph, across territory once loyal to Tikal. It was a golden era for Calakmul, fueled not by brute force, but by strategy, patience, and an almost surgical understanding of Maya geopolitics. But this balance of power didn't last forever. The Maya world was never truly stable. Loyalties shifted like forest winds, and even the greatest empires built on limestone and glyphs could crumble overnight. Tikal, wounded but not dead, began to stir again in the late 7th century. A new king, Jasaw Chan Kawil, would take the throne and eventually lead his people out of the long shadow cast by the Snake dynasty. Still, the rivalry endured. Calakmul and Tikal would clash again, sometimes in open battle, sometimes in quiet acts of subversion. Their war wasn't fought on battlefields alone. It was fought on stone monuments where every glyph was a declaration of dominance, in rituals where the gods were called to witness loyalty, and in marriages where daughters became bridges or weapons, depending on the season. This rivalry shaped the classic Maya period. It forced smaller cities to choose sides, to swear allegiance, or risk annihilation. Some cities tried to remain neutral, but neutrality was rarely an option when two giants fought. The political landscape fractured into a chessboard of alliances, each move echoing with centuries of history. We tend to think of ancient warfare in terms of bloodshed, but in the Maya world, war was also performance. Prisoners were paraded before they were sacrificed. Victories were immortalized in stone, not just to record the event, but to send a message. We are strong. We are favored. The gods are with us. It's in this context that we must understand how deeply the Star War of 562 cut. Tikal wasn't just defeated militarily, it was humiliated ritually. Its shrines weren't merely broken, they were desanctified, their divine authority revoked by enemy hands. And when a city loses the favor of the gods, its people lose more than land or crops, they lose meaning. But even as Tikal went dark, Calakmul continued to write its story in stone. Its monuments multiplied. Its kings claimed titles that stretched beyond their borders. Inscriptions refer to them as Kuhul Ka'anul Ajau, Holy Lords of the Snake, a title heavy with cosmic weight. For a time, it seemed that Calakmul would become the true unifier of the Maya world, and yet the seeds of decline were already being sown, not by enemies but by success. The more Calakmul expanded, the harder it became to hold its web of vassals together. Cities that had once bowed out of fear began to question. Tribute dried up. Distant provinces drifted toward independence. The same fate that had befallen Tikal now loomed over Calakmul. By the 8th century, the tides began to turn once again. Tikal, reborn under Jasau Chan Kawil, launched a daring campaign, and in 695, CE struck a crushing blow against Calakmul. The Lords of the Snake, once invincible, were now vulnerable. Their monuments began to grow less frequent, their inscriptions less confident. The war that began as a cold chess match had come full circle. Power had shifted once again. But at what cost? Because while these two empires traded victories, the land beneath them had changed. Forests were gone. Soil was thin. Rain came less often. And the people, those who farmed, who prayed, who hauled stones to build the dreams of kings, they were weary. And in that silence between wars, something deeper began to break. After the great wars between Tikal and Calakmul had drawn blood across the Maya lowlands, something strange began to happen, something quieter, but no less haunting. One by one, the voices of the cities fell silent. Temples stopped rising. Stone monuments stelae once carved with the names of kings, and their victories ceased to appear. The calendar dates on carvings suddenly halted, like clocks that had stopped ticking. Inscriptions that once recorded triumphs and rituals became gaps in the jungle's memory. Across a wide stretch of the Maya world from the Petén Basin to the Usumacinta River, there came a collective pause. Archaeologists today call this phenomenon the hiatus. It began around the 6th century and lasted in some areas for nearly 100 years. And what makes it so eerie is not what we find, but what we don't. Imagine leafing through a family photo album only to discover that an entire generation is missing. The faces vanish. The celebrations disappear. All that's left is the forest reclaiming its own. The hiatus wasn't a single moment, it was a gradual unraveling. Cities like Dos Pilas Naranjo and Caracol, once bustling centers of power, began showing signs of abandonment. Tikal, as we've seen, entered its own long silence after the devastating Star War of 562. But it wasn't alone. Even smaller towns, ones never involved in the major conflicts, started to fall quiet. No new rulers proclaimed their right to the throne. No great battles were recorded. Even religious ceremonies so central to Maya life seemed to vanish from public view. The plazas, once filled with incense and the sound of conch shells, now echoed only with wind and bird calls. Stone altars stood empty. The gods, it seemed, had been left without witnesses. Why? That's the question scholars have wrestled with for generations. And the answers, if they exist at all, lie buried in fragments in pollen samples taken from lake beds and broken ceramics, under collapsed roofs, in bones, burned, and left in forgotten hearths. But whatever happened, it wasn't sudden. It was a slow suffocation. One theory points to the land itself. The classic Maya cities were marvels of human ingenuity, but they were built in one of the most ecologically fragile regions in the world. The limestone soils of the lowlands were thin, easily exhausted. Intensive agriculture, including the slash-and-burn method known as milpa, took its toll. Over generations, as populations grew and forests fell, the soil began to die, and with it the cities. Farmers were forced to clear land farther and farther from their homes. Transportation of food became harder. Some cities built elaborate reservoirs and raised fields to fight back against environmental limits, but even those couldn't stave off the inevitable. Eventually, even the most advanced infrastructure couldn't feed the mouths inside the walls. But food wasn't the only thing in short supply. Power was too. As the major kingdoms waged their cold wars and plotted against each other, something was happening among the common people, a quiet disillusionment. For centuries, kings had claimed divine right, presenting themselves as the chosen intermediaries between humans and gods. But now, those gods were silent. And when drought came, or crops failed, or temples were raided, the people began to ask why? Why continue to build monuments for kings who couldn't stop the sky from drying up? Why give tribute to rulers who had lost the favor of the gods? And so, in city after city, support eroded. Not in rebellion or civil war, but in quiet steps. A family leaves its farm. A priest stops performing rites. A craftsman lays down his chisel. Nothing dramatic, just absence. There's also the question of leadership. In places like Tikal, we see long gaps in royal succession. Kings vanish from the record, dynasties sputter and fragment. And with no central figure to organize labor, defend borders, or perform rituals, the city becomes just another cluster of buildings in the jungle. Even writing itself began to falter. For a culture that prized the written word, where scribes were holy men and books were made of deer hide and bark, the disappearance of inscriptions is a staggering loss. When the Maya stopped writing, it was as if they stopped believing their future was worth recording. What's striking is that there was no outside invader. This wasn't a conquest. It wasn't a plague or a meteor or some apocalyptic event. Instead, it was something harder to grasp, a slow unraveling from within, like threads loosening from a great tapestry one by one. And still the jungle crept forward. Roots cracked open palace floors. Vines looped through doorways. Rain seeped into the carved glyphs, washing away names, dates, victories. The temples didn't collapse in war, they were abandoned to time. The gods weren't slain, they were forgotten, left to fade into moss-covered silence. The hiatus is not a story of a fall. It's a story of retreat, of a civilization stepping back from the ledge it had once so confidently built, of people turning away not in rebellion, but in resignation. And yet, even in this quiet, there were embers still glowing, because silence, as the Maya knew, is never truly empty. Silence for the Maya wasn't just the absence of noise, it was an omen, a message wrapped in stillness. And during the hiatus, the Maya world listened. What they heard or didn't hear may have reshaped everything. So what caused it? One of the most compelling explanations lies in the sky. Around the 7th and 8th centuries, the Maya lowlands experienced prolonged droughts, a rare but devastating climatic shift. Lake sediments from places like Petén Itzá and Chichancanab show sharp drops in rainfall. Tree rings across Mesoamerica confirm the story decades where the rains came late or not at all. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was existential. The classic Maya built their cities without rivers. No Nile, no Tigris, no Amazon. Instead, they depended on rainfall, stored in choltons, underground cisterns carved into limestone, and giant reservoirs. In times of abundance, these systems worked beautifully. But when the sky failed, so did the cities. Imagine trying to run a metropolis, tens of thousands of people on seasonal rainwater. Then imagine that rain disappearing for years. Crops wilt, wells dry, disease spreads, and in the heat and the hunger comes fear. But climate wasn't the only crack in the foundation. Politics were fraying too. The Maya political system was decentralized, built not around a single empire, but a web of rival city-states, each with its own king calendar gods and agendas. These kings competed for prestige in a zero-sum game. To stay powerful, a ruler had to constantly prove divine favor through conquest ritual construction. If they failed to deliver rain or victory, their legitimacy crumbled. That pressure created an arms race of monument building and warfare, one that couldn't be sustained. Over time, the effort to maintain power consumed more than it returned. Labor diverted from farming to building. Tribute demanded beyond what people could give. When that strain combined with drought, the social contract broke. There's evidence, too, of rising inequality. Palaces expanded, but houses for commoners shrank. Grave goods become more opulent for the elite and sparser for the rest. Some archaeologists suggest that resentment grew silently, especially as leaders continued lavish ceremonies while ordinary people buried children from malnutrition. This growing tension may explain another chilling discovery: mass graves, some containing decapitated skeletons or signs of violent death. Were they victims of war, rebellion, sacrifice? We don't know. But they hint that beneath the quiet, something boiled. In a way, the Maya collapse wasn't a single fall. It was a series of local tipping points spreading like ripples. One city falters, its trade routes dry up. Dependent neighbors lose access to goods. They in turn weaken. Confidence erodes, population shrinks, and soon the forest has taken another block of stone into its green grip. Take Copán, for example, once a jewel of Maya science and astronomy. Its rulers built monuments boasting of divine lineage and cosmic knowledge. But in the late 8th century, the population swelled beyond the valley's capacity. Deforestation led to erosion, then to flooding. Farmlands degraded. Food shortages rose. Eventually, people fled. And this happened not in isolation, but everywhere. By the 9th century, the core of the classic Maya world cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Caracol, Palenque had all begun to lose their hold. Not all at once, but in overlapping waves. Some transformed into ghost towns. Others clung to life, but never regained their former glory. It's important to note this wasn't extinction. The Maya didn't vanish. Their descendants still live today across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They speak Maya languages, maintain cultural traditions, and carry the memory of their ancestors. But the great stone cities, their courts, their temples, their celestial observatories, those became memories, left behind, reclaimed by vines and rain. And maybe that's the most haunting part. The Maya built to defy time. Their pyramids reached toward the stars. Their calendars tracked the cosmos with millennia-long precision. They believed that time wasn't linear but cyclical, that endings were always beginnings. So, perhaps they would not see the hiatus as collapse but as a turning. A page flipped in the great book of ages, because after the silence came something new. Not as grand, not as centralized, but still alive. The post-classic Maya emerged, rebuilding cities like Chichen Itza and Uxmal in the north. Trade routes reopened. New gods were worshipped. Old ones were reimagined. The Maya story didn't end, it adapted. Still, the memory of that long quiet lingers, in the hush between rainfall, in the roots that crack stone, in the broken glyphs where kings once declared eternity and were answered by moss, in the quiet hills of what is now western Honduras, nestled among soft green valleys and mist-kissed forests, once stood one of the crown jewels of Maya civilization, Copán. Unlike the towering presence of Tikal or the political cunning of Calakmul, Copán distinguished itself in a different way. It was a city of thinkers, of astronomers, of sculptors and scholars, a place where stone became a medium for poetry and numbers reached toward the stars. At its height in the 8th century, Copán was home to tens of thousands. Its kings weren't just warriors, they were priests, mathematicians, keepers of time. The city's architecture rose not just to impress, but to align with celestial events. Its ball court, among the most intricately decorated in the Maya world, echoed with the chants of ritual games tied to myth and astronomy. Its temples were carved with astonishing depth, each glyph telling a story that bridged earth and sky. But nothing embodied Copán's brilliance more than its hieroglyphic stairway, a marvel of ambition and memory. Comprising over 2,000 individual glyphs, the stairway is the longest known Maya inscription in the world. It stretches like a stone manuscript across the steps of Temple 26, recounting 4 centuries of royal lineage, mythic origin, and divine right. Every step, every block was meant to be walked, not just by feet, but by the eyes of future kings. The mind behind this was Waxaclajun Uba'a Kawil, more commonly known as 18 Rabbit, the 13th ruler of Copán. He was not just a builder, but a philosopher king. Under his reign, the city reached artistic heights unmatched elsewhere, its stelae portraying him not only as a sovereign, but as an embodiment of cosmic forces. The level of refinement in Copán's sculptures, subtle lips, flowing garments, symbolic detail was so advanced, some modern archaeologists compare it to the classical beauty of ancient Greece. And yet, even as the stonework reached perfection, cracks were forming beneath the soil. By the late 700s, Copán's population had grown far beyond the capacity of its valley. To feed everyone, forests were cleared at an alarming rate. Hillsides were stripped bare. Without trees to hold, the earth rains washed away the topsoil. The fertile terraces that once nourished maize and beans began to collapse into erosion gullies. Water became harder to find. The people dug deeper and worked harder, but the land gave less and less in return. The signs of ecological strain began to surface in the bones. Skeletal remains from this period show malnutrition, particularly among children. There's evidence of anemia, stunted growth, and dental decay, symptoms of a society pushing past its natural limits. Even as Copán's kings erected ever more elaborate monuments, their people were starving. The contrast is jarring, golden thrones above empty bowls below. And then came the fall. Around 738 AD, the unthinkable happened. Quirigua, a much smaller city to the north, and long considered a vassal of Copán, suddenly struck. Led by its king Kak Tiliu, Chan Yopat, Quirigua captured and executed 18 Rabbit, a stunning political coup that shifted the power dynamics of the region. The details remain murky. Did Quirigua act alone? Were they backed by Calakmul, seeking to undermine Copán's influence? We may never know, but the result was devastating. The king who had built so much, who had immortalized his dynasty in stone, was beheaded in a foreign plaza, his death recorded not by Copán, but by his enemies. Without 18, Rabbit, Copán faltered. His successors tried to maintain appearances, erecting stelae, holding rituals, but the heart of the city was broken. The trade routes that had once enriched its markets were rerouted. Its population began to dwindle. Over the next century, the great city became a shadow of itself, and perhaps the saddest part, the hieroglyphic stairway, meant to preserve the memory of kings, was misassembled during its reconstruction. The glyphs, once a perfectly ordered lineage, now lay jumbled. A puzzle out of sequence. A history scrambled. It feels metaphorical. Copán, the city of order, the city of memory, could no longer remember itself. And yet in its ruins, something still breathes. Today, if you visit the site at dawn, the fog clings to the ruins like memory itself. Parrots screech from the trees. The carvings on the stelae are worn but legible. And if you walk slowly listening, you might still hear the echoes of a people who looked up at the stars, not just in wonder but with understanding. Copán didn't fall to war or plague. It fell to its own success. It flew too close to the sun, and when the land could no longer bear its brilliance, it gently, painfully came down. While Copán faded into the mist with tragic grace, other Maya centers danced a different rhythm, some rising from obscurity, others defying decline, at least for a while. Among these was Quirigua, the very city that had shocked the region by executing its former overlord 18 Rabbit. Quirigua's story is one of ambition, strategy, and a brief but brilliant flare in the historical sky. For much of its early life, Quirigua was a tributary state overshadowed by Copán's architectural splendor and cultural authority. Its monuments were smaller, its kings little more than placeholders in a narrative written by others. But under Kaktiliu, Chanyopat, all that changed. After defeating Copán in 738 AD, Quirigua surged into the spotlight. For a few decades, it poured its resources into building massive stelae, some standing over 35 feet tall, heavily carved with intricate glyphs and kingly portraits, as if shouting to the heavens, "We matter now." It was a defiant bloom, and a short one. Quirigua never expanded far beyond its core. Its rise was meteoric, but not sustained. After a generation or two, the city once again settled into silence, its monuments standing proud but lonely, like songs no one sings anymore. Meanwhile, to the west, Tikal stirred from its long slumber. The city that had once ruled with confidence, then lost everything in a bitter star war, began a careful recovery. Around 682 AD, a new king named Jasa Chankawil I ascended the throne. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a restorer. Under his guidance, Tikal not only rebuilt its monuments, but reasserted itself as a force in Maya politics. One of his greatest triumphs was the defeat of Calakmul in 695, a symbolic reversal of the humiliation his city had endured more than a century earlier. To celebrate, Tikal raised temple. His own funerary monument, known today as the Temple of the Great Jaguar, and constructed Temple II, across from it, possibly for his queen. These temples, perched on the edge of the Grand Plaza, still dominate the skyline, their steep steps catching morning light like pyramids reborn. But the Maya world was shifting. The centers of gravity were moving north. Cities like Uxmal Edzna, and most famously Chichen Itza, began to rise in the Yucatan Peninsula. Their architecture was different, broader, lower, with columns and open courtyards, suggesting a change not just in style, but in function. Some scholars believe these cities reflected a new kind of governance, more collective and less dynastic, perhaps in response to the very failures that had doomed the southern lowlands. Chichen Itza in particular became a beacon of this new era. By the 9th and 10th centuries, it had developed into a sprawling metropolis with influences from across Mesoamerica. Toltec motifs, serpentine staircases, observatories, ball courts on a scale unseen before. It was a fusion city, a cosmopolitan experiment. And for a while, it worked. But even this northern renaissance had its limits. By the time the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, most of the great Maya cities north and south had already been abandoned or diminished. Some were still inhabited, but their glory days were long past. Their temples cracked, their markets quiet, their rulers gone. And yet, the people remained. That's the thread often missed in tales of collapse. The Maya did not vanish. They adapted, shifted, survived. In the highlands of Guatemala, in the jungles of Chiapas, in the villages of Belize, millions of Maya still live today. Their languages echo ancient glyphs. Their calendars still track time. Their rituals honor a past that never truly ended. To them, the cities swallowed by vines are not ruins. They are resting places. Places where ancestors sleep beneath stone, waiting for the right moment to wake again. The story of the Maya is not a single arc. It's a tapestry of rises, falls, reinventions, and quiet endurance. It's Copán carving genius into limestone, then watching it erode. It's Quirigua defying fate only to fall silent. It's Tikal resurrecting itself one temple at a time. And it's Chichen Itza dreaming bigger, blending worlds, reaching for something new. Even in collapse, they left behind mathematics, without equals astronomy, aligned to the stars' architecture that defied the jungle, and a philosophy of time that humbles us still. And maybe that's what matters most. Not that their cities fell, but that their vision of the cosmos and our place in it still whispers through the leaves across Stele and into the ears of those willing to listen. If you were to stand today in the jungles of Petin, beneath the towering ceiba trees that once shaded the plazas of kings, you'd be surrounded, not just by the ruins of a past civilization, but by something more enduring, something alive. The cities may have fallen silent, but the people, they never left. Never. The Maya did not vanish. It's a myth born from colonial arrogance and the eerie hush that settled over stone temples. But behind the crumbling pyramids and overgrown causeways lies a story not of disappearance, but of adaptation. A story of persistence so quiet it was mistaken for absence. After the Spanish arrived in the early 1500s, Maya communities didn't simply collapse. They resisted. They retreated deeper into the forests, into the mountains, into language and ceremony. While the conquistadors burned codices and tore down altars, the Maya shifted their rituals behind closed doors. They baptized their children with Christian names. Yes, but whispered the old prayers beneath their breath. They knelt at church altars while dreaming of May's gods. They wore Catholic saints like masks, and underneath the ancient faces still stared out. And in doing so, they survived. Through epidemics, forced labor taxation, forced relocations, through centuries of colonial violence, the Maya held onto the most powerful weapon they had: memory. Today, over 7 million Maya people live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They speak dozens of languages: Quiche, Yucatec, Quechua, Tzotzil, each descended from the same linguistic roots carved into ancient stelae. In villages scattered across the highlands and lowlands, farmers still consult the stars before planting. Midwives still chant the names of the wind. Elders still gather stories passed from tongue to tongue, generation to generation, each word a vessel. And perhaps most impressively, they continue to keep time. The long count calendar, once believed to predict an apocalyptic 2012, never actually claimed the world would end. That interpretation came from Western misunderstanding sensationalized in headlines and movies. In truth, the Maya saw time as cyclical, sacred, layered. Baktuns, Katuns, tunes each unit part of a cosmic rhythm like gears in a clock designed not to end but to turn forever. When December 21st, 2012 approached the supposed doomsday, many modern Maya communities prepared not for destruction, but for celebration. To them, it was not an ending, but a renewal, a chance to begin again as their ancestors had done countless times before. But their legacy isn't limited to calendars or ruins. Take Day of the Dead, for instance. Celebrated widely across Mexico and Central America, it's often viewed as a Catholic festival infused with Aztec roots. But woven into its fabric are distinctly Maya, threads the belief in cyclical time, the presence of ancestors, the use of marigolds to guide spirits home. In many Maya villages, altars or ofrendas are built not just to honor family, but to reaffirm that life and death are not opposites. They are companions. Or look at agriculture. For millennia, the Maya practiced milpa, farming a rotational method of planting maize beans and squashed-together plants that complement each other biologically and nutritionally. This method wasn't just efficient, it was sustainable. Long before the term regenerative agriculture became trendy, Maya farmers were healing the land as they fed their families. Today, in the face of soil degradation and climate change, scientists are returning to these ancient practices, recognizing them not as primitive, but brilliant. Even in architecture, Maya influence endures. Modern Maya masons still build homes with corbel arches, use limestone plaster, and orient structures to celestial alignments. Some communities continue the tradition of astronomical observation, using horizon markers and shadow patterns to signal solstices and equinoxes. centuries-old knowledge passed without textbooks. In the realm of activism too, the Maya are far from silent. In Guatemala, leaders like Rigoberta Menchú, a Quiché Maya woman, have brought indigenous struggles to the world stage. Her memoir of surviving the Guatemalan Civil War, marked by genocide against Maya communities, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. Her voice, and the voices of others like her, have challenged governments-inspired resistance and preserved dignity in the face of oppression. And yet, for all their endurance, the Maya still battle invisibility. Many live in poverty. Their lands are threatened by mining, deforestation, and tourism. Their languages are often underfunded, their stories reduced to footnotes or museum plaques. Tourists visit Chichen Itza or Palenque, marveling at the stones, but few ask about the people still living in their shadows. It's a bitter irony. We admire the temples but ignore the builders' descendants. We map the past while overlooking the present, and still the Maya persist. They sing in marketplaces. They weave constellations into cloth. They hold festivals where the past and present dance not as strangers, but as old friends. They gather in council to protect rivers, to defend sacred sites, to teach children that they carry galaxies in their names. The jungle, for its part, keeps the rhythm. Vines crawl over old plazas not to erase but to protect. Rain falls on both ruin and village. Howler monkeys echo through the canopy like timekeepers marking the next Katun. And somewhere, a child looks up at the same sky her ancestors once read, wondering what stories the stars still hold. Because the Maya story isn't over. It's not a relic, it's a pulse. It's still beating in ceremonies, in classrooms, in protests, and lullabies. It beats in every stela carved with a face that gazes forward, not backward. In every glyph that records not just what was, but what might be. In every footstep that echoes through the jungles of Tikal or the markets of Chiapas. The Maya did not vanish. They endured, they evolved, and they remind us quietly but profoundly that greatness isn't just measured in what you build, but in what you remember, protect, and pass on. So the next time you hear the wind through the ruins, or see the sun cast long shadows down the steps of a forgotten temple, listen closely. It may not be silence you're hearing. It might just be the voice of a civilization that never stopped whispering.